They were smuggled out under fear of death, because inside them was treason, not against a ruler, but against the idea that any ruler could rule a man who ruled himself. And those weren't the only texts. There were more. Tomes erased by the fires of Alexandria, codices banned by Christian emperors, when their God couldn't compete with a man who feared nothing. There was a Stoic gospel once, not of divinity, but of indifference to death. It spoke of the Logos, a rational flame within all things, not a deity, a force, a truth, buried in nature, logic, and will. They erased it, called it heresy, because if the Logos lived in you, why would you kneel to them? This was the secret Rome tried to entomb, and still, it survived, because Stoicism isn't paper, it isn't ink. It's practice. It's pain endured with stillness. It's love lost without collapse. It's the decision to stand alone, fully, finally, and without apology. The Stoics did not chase. They did not beg. They did not explain. Their silence terrified tyrants, because it could not be interpreted, could not be weaponized, could not be sold. Marcus knew this. He wrote, "To live a good life, we have the potential for it. If we learn to be indifferent to what makes no difference, let that sink in. The world will offer you 1,000 things to care about, 1,000 enemies, 1,000 urgencies, but the Stoic, he sees through it. He slices away the noise. With the scalpel of reason, he asks one question: is this within my control? If yes, he acts with discipline. If no, he releases with dignity, not passivity, mastery. Because a man who is governed only by what he governs within cannot be enslaved. This is why Rome fell, not because the Stoics failed, but because Rome forgot them. It replaced the inner citadel with opulence, replaced reason with spectacle, virtue with indulgence, courage with comfort. And that's where you were born, not in the ruins of Rome, but in the ruins of what replaced it. You were taught to crave, taught to obey, taught to emote instead of endure. But deep inside, beneath the layers of noise and programming, there is something older, something that doesn't flinch, doesn't chase, doesn't beg, and sure as hell doesn't explain. It waits, it listens, it watches. That part of you? It's Stoic. It always has been. It's the part of you that knows comfort is a cage, that validation is a leash, that weakness wears the mask of virtue, that stillness, the kind you can hear now between these words. That's not fear, that's readiness. You don't need more motivation. You need an exorcism to purge the softness, to remove the mental malware that told you emotion is truth, reaction is power, victimhood is sacred. None of that is real. What's real is this: discipline, judgment, voluntary hardship, voluntary silence, voluntary sovereignty. What Marcus did in a tent surrounded by enemies. If you suffer before necessity, you suffer more than is necessary. This was not a quote. It was a warning. Etched into stone, hidden, buried beneath ash, burned into silence. Because it wasn't meant for you. Not then. And maybe not even now. You were never supposed to know this. Never meant to hear what I'm about to say. Because this is Rome's forbidden code. The psychological weapon used by emperors, generals, and outlaws to dominate themselves so completely that no man, no system, no empire could break them. And they tried. They tried with fire, with exile, with flattery, with poison. But the Stoic mind doesn't shatter. It calcifies. It sharpens. It turns agony into strategy. You've heard the word Stoicism, a quote on Instagram, a book in a self-help aisle, some whisper about Marcus Aurelius. But the truth is deeper, darker, older than any translation you've read, and far more dangerous. Because Stoicism was never for the masses. It wasn't created for comfort. It was forged for control. Mental control over chaos, over fear, over death. They call Marcus a philosopher king, but his meditations, they weren't meant for publication. They were his battlefield mind journals, a psychological war map. He never wrote them to inspire anyone. He wrote them to keep himself sane. As the Roman Empire crumbled from within, as betrayal came from his own blood, as plagues emptied cities, as barbarian hordes burned the edges of the known world. Inside those pages are not quotes. They're incantations, mental software upgrades for a mind tasked with ruling an empire while resisting madness. And the man who trained Marcus? He was no emperor. He was a slave. His name was Epictetus, crippled by torture, owned by a Roman master, mocked, starved, beaten, and still untouchable, because his freedom didn't live in the body, it lived behind his eyes, where no whip, no chains, no emperor could ever reach. Epictetus discovered something deadly. The truth that the entire empire stood upon was a lie. That if a man could learn to control his own judgment, his own reactions, his own mind, he would need no king, no religion, no savior. He would become sovereign, internally sovereign. He called it the discipline of assent, the power to decide in the moment whether any external event was worthy of disturbing the soul. And when Rome realized what he was teaching, they watched, they listened, then they tried to extinguish it. Because men like that, men who cannot be flattered or broken, they threaten every hierarchy. But it didn't stop there. Seneca came next, a senator, a statesman, a poet with steel in his voice. He mentored Nero. Yes, that Nero, the same emperor, who played the lyre as cities burned. Seneca wrote not to calm. He wrote to arm, to prepare minds for betrayal, pain, injustice, and to make them unshakable in it. He wrote letters to Lucilius, letters so precise you can do in your own mind. What Epictetus forged in chains, you can forge in solitude. What Seneca whispered into sealed letters, you now hear clearer than they ever dreamed possible. They tried to kill this knowledge, but you're hearing it now, which means you were meant to. And now that you have, there's no going back. The next section will go deeper, past philosophy, into psychological warfare, because they've inverted Stoicism. They use it against you. And unless you rebuild the inner citadel, you will be ruled from the inside by everything they've hidden in plain sight. Stay sharp. The mind you forge next may be the only real freedom you ever own. Marcus Aurelius called it the inner citadel, not a metaphor, not a metaphorical safe space, a real construction, brick by mental brick, a fortress inside his mind, built to resist madness, betrayal, poison, war, and worst of all, manipulation. Because even a Roman emperor could be ruled by emotion, by public pressure, by family, by fear. He knew the throne meant nothing if his mind could still be conquered. So he built his citadel. Each morning, he would rise before the empire, not to pray, not to scroll, but to prepare, to go to war with his own expectations, to audit his mind for weakness. And here's what they won't tell you. That same system Marcus forged is now being used against you. You've been trained to believe you're free, But freedom without discipline is just chaos in disguise. You weren't taught to govern your mind. You were taught to outsource it. To screens, to trends, to impulses, to algorithms. They've hijacked your judgments, hijacked your fears, hijacked your reward systems. You think you make decisions? Scroll longer, react faster, chase harder. But a Stoic doesn't react. He chooses. Every modern system, marketing, media, schools, relationships, they all use anti-Stoicism as their root doctrine. You are taught, react quickly, speak instantly, feel everything, be offended, complain, express. But Marcus wrote, if it's not right, don't do it. If it's not true, don't say it. That one line would implode most of today's platforms because they are powered by your inability to resist stimulation. But a true Stoic has rules, mental protocol, a firewall. He doesn't post because he's angry. He doesn't reply to be seen. He doesn't explain himself to people unworthy of judgment because he knows to explain is to concede territory. And here's the inversion. The more open you are, the more predictable you become. Predictable means programmable. Programmable means controllable. That's why your silence terrifies them. It signals that you're not playing. It signals that the algorithm no longer owns you. And when they can't track your emotions, they can't steer your decisions. That's why Stoicism was purged from popular consciousness. Not because it was outdated, but because it was immune. You're told today to speak your truth. The Stoic says, truth needs no announcement, only action. You're told to chase purpose. The Stoic says, purpose is not something you find. It's something you forge in discomfort, daily. You're told to beg for understanding, to explain every choice, to be transparent. But Marcus didn't explain. Seneca didn't beg. Epictetus didn't chase. They withdrew. They focused. They governed. And in that withdrawal, they became untouchable. Now look around. What are you rewarded for? Outrage, addiction, over-explaining, emotional volatility. That's not accidental. That's conditioning. Your discipline is their enemy. Your detachment is their threat. Because a man who no longer chases, no longer buys, a man who no longer begs, no longer obeys, a man who no longer explains, can no longer be guilted. This is psychological warfare, and the Stoics knew it. Thousands of years ago, they taught, you can endure anything if you remove the opinion that it's suffering. You can win any battle if you remove the fear of loss. You can defeat any tyrant if you no longer fear being alone. So ask yourself, what are they using to own you? Fear of judgment? Fear of rejection? Fear of being misunderstood? Good. Those are your weapons now. You transmute them, not escape, not run. Transmute. This is the Stoic path. A laboratory of voluntary discomfort. A temple of mental calibration. A battlefield where you bleed internally, so nothing external can ever wound you again. You suffer the small things now, so the world cannot impose big things later. You say no when it's inconvenient. You stay silent when you crave validation. You choose principle over performance. And in doing so, you stop being a participant. You become an observer, a strategist, a sovereign. Now look at your hands. Are they shaking? Look at your thoughts. Are they spiraling? Good. That means you feel it. The resistance, the pull back into comfort. Ignore it. You are at the gate of the inner citadel now. This next moment is not commentary. It is initiation. To cross the threshold, you must claim your identity, not with noise, but with ritual. Go to the comments and write Amor Fati twice forged. Write it once to claim the name. Write it again to seal it. This is not a hashtag. This is a cipher, a code that the others will recognize. We are building a network, not of followers, but of unshakable minds. And the algorithm, it doesn't know what to do with this. It cannot track purpose. It cannot suppress stillness. It cannot defeat men who choose pain over sedation. You are not your profile. You are not your history. You are not your pain. You are what you can endure without needing to speak of it. You are what you can lose without losing yourself. You are what you can choose when every voice tells you to conform. The Stoics trained themselves to expect betrayal, to expect slander, to expect discomfort. That's why they didn't collapse. That's why their writings survived fire. That's why their names are being whispered again now. Not because they were perfect, but because they were forged. Once by life, twice by will. So when you write, Amor Fati twice forged, you declare your loyalty, not to a philosophy, but to a discipline older than time. Love your fate, forge yourself, then forge yourself again. No mentor is coming, no savior is coming, only this moment. And the voice inside you that refuses to kneel. If you've made it here, you're not watching a video, you're awakening to the most dangerous idea in history, that your mind is your last free territory, and if you govern it, you govern everything. The next section will take you deeper, not into theory, not into history. Now you begin, not with fire, not with ceremony, but with a decision, a silent oath, in your own mind, where no one can reach but you. You've heard the history, you've seen the inversion. Now comes the final phase. Rebellion, not against a nation, not against a person, but against your own programming. This is the moment where the old identity dies, where the broken boy gets buried, where the man is forged in silence, not one forged by applause, but one forged by discipline, so deep, it becomes invisible. You don't need motivation. You need ritual. You don't need to feel ready. You need to act, especially when you don't, because the Stoic knows every action trains the mind. Every indulgence weakens it. So you begin here. You wake before the world floods in, before the phone, before the dopamine drip, before someone tells you who you are, and you sit in silence, in stillness, in combat readiness. You audit the battlefield of your thoughts, and you repeat, I govern what I allow. I suffer only what I permit. I fear only what I worship. And then you move, not because you're inspired, but because you said you would. That's discipline. That's the Stoic rebellion. It doesn't look like fire. It looks like quiet control. And as the world screams, you sharpen in the shadows. You don't share your goals. You become them. You don't explain your silence. You weaponize it. You don't post your pain. You transmute it into action or nothing at all. Because the sovereign man owes no explanations to systems he never asked for. And what happens next? You begin to terrify people, not because you are cruel, but because you are clear. You no longer chase people who walk away. You no longer beg to be understood. You no longer perform for people who haven't earned your truth. And in that shift, you stop being predictable. You stop being readable. You become dangerous, because a man who can govern himself cannot be governed by them, and they will feel it. Your boss, your enemies, your old friends, even the voice in your head that used to control you with doubt. All of them will feel your withdrawal, not as absence, but as dominance. You don't react anymore. You decide. You don't explain anymore. You embody. You don't complain anymore. You build. And you start to realize you don't need to be understood. You need to be undisturbed. You don't need to be liked. You need to be disciplined. You don't need to be seen. You need to be centered. Because now, you're building something. An inner empire. No walls. No flags. No speeches. Just discipline. Reason. Strategy. And silence. And here's the truth most can't swallow. Your silence is stronger than their argument. Your solitude is more dangerous than their popularity. Your self-governance is more powerful than their need to control. That's why the Stoics never craved attention. They craved alignment. With nature. With reality. With truth. Not your truth. The truth. Not your truth. The truth. That pain comes. That betrayal comes. That death comes. And you endure it all. Without complaint. Without collapse. Without losing your virtue. Because you no longer fear loss. You've already sacrificed what you were never meant to keep. Comfort. Approval. Image. Validation. All of it was a leash. All of it gone. And what's left? A man. A man who does not flinch. Does not fumble. Does not fold. He bends but never breaks. He adapts, but never apologizes for his strength. He speaks but never begs to be heard. And slowly the mind transforms from chaos into clarity, from craving into command, from weakness into weaponized stillness. You become the thing the system cannot decode, not because you're hiding, but because you no longer need to be seen. Not because you hate, but because you've outgrown their approval. Not because you're cold, but because your warmth is earned, not given. This is the man they tried to delete. Not from history, but from the present. This is why Stoicism was watered down, sold as calmness, sold as peace. But real Stoicism is not peace. It is preparation. It is the daily rehearsal of every loss you will one day face. So when it comes, and it will, you do not flinch. You do not shatter. You do not fall to pieces. You simply say, Amor, Fati. I accept. I endure. I advance. And now there's no going back. The man who's been awakened cannot return to sedation. He'll start to see it everywhere now. How weakness is monetized. How virtue is weaponized. How systems feed on your emotional volatility. But you will remain centered. Because the true Stoic doesn't try to fix the world. He fixes his perception of it. He doesn't wait for fairness. He prepares for unfairness. He doesn't avoid suffering. He absorbs it, processes it, and transforms it. And now you are part of that lineage, not of philosophers, of warriors in the mind. You do not need robes. You do not need quotes. You need discipline and daily execution. You need silence that sharpens, not the silence of fear, but the silence of focus. You need rejection, so you can confirm that you belong to yourself. You need discomfort, so your comfort never becomes weakness. You need death, metaphorical and real, to remind you, every day is a chance to begin again, twice forged. So what now? You don't announce a new chapter. You become it. You don't chase peace. You train for war of the mind, of the will, of the soul. Because the true Stoic isn't emotionless. He feels everything, but chooses what deserves a response. He sees chaos and becomes order. He sees betrayal and becomes loyal to himself. He sees weakness and becomes a fortress. This is not a trend. This is not a brand. This is who you were before the world got to you. Never chase. Never beg. Never explain. They'll say you've changed. Good. You're mastering it from within. You are the Stoic, twice forged, burned and rebuilt. And now, you are ungovernable,